Recording here on one side. See? Okay, so we're recording. And this session is Ethics Bowl in the classroom. And depending on crowd size, we might break into a couple of breakouts. Just really depends on if people would like to be able to have smaller conversations or not. So we've got some different people who can facilitate those breakout discussions if we decide that's where we want to go. I'm going to mute myself for a second just to talk to Kristen about logistics of that. Okay, awesome. Well, anyways, welcome back, everyone. I'm going to ask you a couple of emoji-based questions here to just get some straw polling. And then we'll sort of launch into things. And so if you go down to reactions here, you've got different, we got the thumbs up, we got the clappy hands, we've got the laughing and crying emoji. So I'm curious sort of how many of you use Ethics Bowl cases currently in your teaching of your classes. So if you just want to give a thumbs up emoji for you use Ethics Bowl cases for teaching in your classroom right now. So
you mean non-Ethics Bowl classes, right?
Any class that you teach. We'll just start with that. And I'm going to ask a second question about whether you have specific Ethics Bowl classes. Okay, so not the majority, but a fair bit of people. So this will be good. All right, so if you want to get rid of your thumbs, I'm going to ask a second thumbs up, thumbs down question. I'm just curious, how many people have classes that are dedicated to the Ethics Bowl that are essentially almost designed to feed competing in the Ethics Bowl, where the whole class is designed around the Ethics Bowl? Okay. Great, so it's roughly the same people, so that's interesting. So we'll have time today to talk about both of those things, building sort of the Ethics Bowl competition type classroom space. But what I thought we'd start with is sort of the opposite of that question. What I'm curious about, I've been thinking in my mind about the difference between using ethics classes to prepare a team for the Ethics Bowl on one hand, and on the other hand, thinking about Ethics Bowl, using our coaching experience to inform our teaching. And I'll give you a quick example of what I mean there. Because of coaching Ethics Bowl teams over the years, I'm realizing that, when I coach an Ethics Bowl team or, you see a presentation and somebody makes use of the idea from Kant of treating someone as an end in themselves and not as a means only, they don't need to understand the whole metaphysical underpinning of how Kant arrives at that in his treatment of autonomy, et cetera. Yet I had been in the habit for a decade plus of spending 2 weeks in my ethics class talking about that because I find it neat. And I realized that might be a little too self-gratifying. But also that it might not actually be serving my students that well, because maybe 1 out of every 150 students I teach will continue on to be a philosophy major. And the ability to think productively about ethical issues is more important than having a high-level grasp of ethical theory. So one question I wanted to start with is just, for those of you who have used Ethics Bowl in the classrooms or just have experience coaching and are also teachers, in what ways have you found that your involvement in coaching has shaped your teaching? And then we can sort of come back to this question of how we use our teaching to shape our coaching. So I'll just throw it open with that. And if I see 50 hands go up, then we'll start to think about breakout sessions. And if not, we'll kind of hang out in one large group for a bit. Ron, get us started.
Yeah. So I could have noticed, especially when you brought it up, that in my introduction to philosophy classes, I had always been rather discussion oriented, but now I foreground that to a larger extent. Now that I've been coaching Ethics Bowl, I really focus on pointing out that the discussion is the important part. Right, rather than just simply having the discussion, I make sure that I highlight the fact that the discussion is kind of the point of the exercise in a big way, rather than learning the material. It's engaging with the material. And I think I've gotten a lot of that from Ethics Bowl.
So, other thoughts just about how coaching experience, or even, I don't know if any of your students, but that you sort of think about teaching and learning ethics differently because of your involvement with Ethics Bowl? Richard?
Yeah, so I guess I'm sort of doing similar things to Ron. At some point, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago, after having been involved with the Ethics Bowl for a while, it dawned on me that my ethics bowlers were much more sophisticated ethical reasoners than were the students in my philosophy classes, even the upper division courses where, you know, they've been through the applied course and now I'm teaching them ethical theory, right? And so the insight led me to sort of revise the way that I teach my gen ed courses. So, you know, historically I would do a traditional applied ethics course with all the standard abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment type issues that you might have seen. And I've swapped all that out over the years. Like John, I'm doing much less theory, just giving them thumbnail sketches, different perspectives and approaches. And then we just go through tons of Ethics Bowl cases with group discussions. And I think the payoff of that is the students get very good at approaching contemporary moral problems using, you know, what I sort of consider to be the Ethics Bowl method. And then I'll do one traditional, large applied ethics issue, just to show them, you know, how to do a much deeper dive than you might do on just an Ethics Bowl case. We'll look at justice and economic distribution or something like that. But yeah, so being an Ethics Bowl coach taught me that there's a much better way to get people to be good moral reasoners than just shouting theory at them for weeks on end.
Great, thanks, Richard. Larry, I'm going to get to you in 1 second, but I just wanted to point to the comment in the chat about I see the email and I can't get back up to the name quick enough. So it's some Jay Flanagan at Richmond is new to teaching it. Oh, hey, Jess. So just a quick comment is that, yeah, I just wrote your email down and I'd be happy to send you something, and I think other people will too. And we need to update something that's on the Ethics Bowl part of the ABBY website, which is we have some Ethics Bowl resources up there, and we could start to continue to populate that with syllabi, things like that. Usually it's the workshop that is a catalyst to us adding materials to that. So you might see some of that coming up, but yeah, excited that you're part of wanting to get this into your classes. So hopefully we'll talk more about that here in a minute. Yeah, Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I don't typically teach intro to ethics. I teach intro to philosophy. I think if I was teaching intro to ethics, first of all, I'd use a lot of Ethics Bowl cases. Although I have a healthy respect for theory, and so I would really want to do the theory for its own sake, because I'm sort of a distant Rawls learner. That is, I do philosophy like Rawls, and I want to do the texts. And so I want my students in 101 to read the Republic and read Aristotle and understand the text. But because I use a little Rawls in my 101 class, I get a lot of ethics issues into it. And I try to connect a lot of the issues, because a lot of it is political philosophy, plus I do Adam Smith. And so there are ways to bring in the contemporary world. But it's interesting, because what I'm looking to do in my 101 class related to Ethics Bowl is I'm recruiting from a next year's Ethics Bowl team. And I think my students who come out of my 101 class are really ready to do Ethics Bowl. It's like, okay, now you know the text, let's apply it to the world. And like because I don't get a whole lot of help recruiting, usually my team has a lot of my 101 students in it. And so they can all talk the language, and we can talk about markets, and we can talk about the basic structure, and they've read Rawls a little bit, and we read Martin Luther King in my 101 class, a letter from Birmingham jail. So it just comes into Ethics Bowl, but I'm not thinking in terms of the stuff in the Ethics Bowl in my class. I'm sort of using it the other way around. But if I was doing intro to ethics, I think I definitely want to do Ethics Bowl stuff. Although when I did intro to ethics, a book that I used that I think I would still use if I was doing that, and sort of like an alternative Ethics Bowl type thing, is Cecil Bach's book, Lying. I think is a tremendous book for because it's a concrete application of, and you can talk about Kant, and she talks about Kant, and she talks about the utilitarians, and she frames it in terms of, it's an old book, but it's in a way all the better for that. It's a 1970 something. So if you haven't looked at it, I really recommend it. Be okay. And the book is just called Lying. Moral Choice in Public and Private Life, I think is the subtitle. I haven't taught ethics in about 15 years, but I always use that book together with readings. This was before I even knew about Ethics Bowl.
Great, thanks. Michael, and then Suzanne.
Yeah, so I love the Ethics Bowl cases. I've been coaching for about 20 years, and I teach applied ethics at San Jose State University. And I find that it's such a plethora of examples, of practical examples to use for students. And one of the things that I love about the Ethics Bowl is every year, we do 15 to 30 new cases, depending on if you make it all the way to nationals. And so, I just bank those and I use them constantly in my classes, and I figure out which ones students really react to, which ones maybe they don't find as interesting. And I really try to focus on that initially to start a lot of, I think, really good discussion. So the ethics cases absolutely help guide the way that I teach my ethics classes now. I love them.
Great, Suzanne.
Okay, so while I was an undergraduate philosophy major, I remember my my philosophy courses in general, when we reached seminar levels, they were very lively and engaging. And I didn't do philosophy for a bit. And then when I went back to a master's degree program that had a business school component, I got reintroduced to the field of, business ethics. So I'm in a class with students, MBA students who are coming from Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, and they're just very uncivilized, right? In terms of how they talk, how they interact. Do you think by introducing the sort of civility and collaborative nature of the Ethics Bowl into a business seminar boardroom setting, is that real? Because that's not how people talk or deal with each other in the, in some spheres of business. They're really ruthless. So are you setting up your students to not be ready for that real world, rat race and all that in the business world, those who teach business ethics?
So I'm going to let other people jump in with the answer to this. I'm going to give a bit of a naive answer, I think, is we're going to talk later this weekend about virtues and values of the bowl. And I think it's an interesting question that you raised about preparing people for what their real world is really like, right? Because I think what the Ethics Bowl at the high school and college level is really trying to do is model and instill almost counterculture programming against some of these things to try to model civility and real listening and real deliberation. But I don't think, and here's the non-naive part of this, I don't think any of us are under the illusion that that is all that there is when it comes to thinking about these issues. I mean, there's a space for advocacy. There's a space for, knowing how to debate with, rhetorical tricks and dazzle, effectively, and people need to navigate various spaces. But I think being self-aware of what our goals are and also helping to be transparent with our students about those can be really useful to say, we're doing this for these reasons. And, I'd like for, the Ethics Bowl started at Illinois Institute of Technology. So it wasn't started in this, it was just a bunch of things for philosophers. It was about teaching engineering students that there are ethical issues in their professions. And so helping them to understand that they can't just have this like very, all they're considered about are the practical issues of what they're doing, and they have to think about these ethical issues. So I think it's about finding our space more than anything else. We got a flurry of hands here, and I realized a year ago that the participant list helps me figure out who's first. And you also show up on the screen this way. So Eric is first, and then Michael, and then Kyle.
Thank you, John, for the floor. I teach business ethics and legal ethics at Rollins College, and I teach clinical ethics at FSU's medical school. And I use ethics bowl cases in each of the courses that I teach. What I've found is two things. First, we had presumed for a long time that people understand thinking about ethics and how thinking about ethics can influence the way people act in the real world. And when I say how they act in the real world, here I don't mean how they engage with others. I mean how they end up coming to decisions. So we presumed that for a long time. And then what we found is that's not the case. So medical schools and business schools and law schools now have developed ethics courses. And they've developed ethics courses because they found that something like what Suzanne is saying, when people in the legal world and the business world engage with one another, they don't engage ethically. And they think, like I just said, that teaching people to think about ethics will help influence their behavior. So that's the first thing I found. And then the second thing I found is that when it comes to my students, that students recognize what Suzanne has said too, and that the majority of them actually don't like to engage that way with one another. They much more prefer the sort of ethics bowl style engagement where it's collaborative, particularly this new generation of students. So they much more prefer a collaborative way of engaging with one another, and they dislike the sort of winner take all authoritarian politics that they see. So I think that in addition to helping people think about ethics, ethics bowl style of reasoning in a classroom has a role to play in changing the discourse going forward. It might not do it immediately, but because of the new generation that we have, and because of the dislike among adults and students with the way things are happening in the business world, the political world, and legal world, I think Ethics Bowl has a really important role to play in demonstrating how it might be done differently. So that's why I use the Ethics Bowl material in my courses.
Yeah. Michael, just before we get to you, I'm just gonna take my prerogative here and insert my 2 cents real fast. Eric, what I like about what you just said is I think in addition to, when we think about Ethics Bowl in our classes, we often think about just using cases and stuff like that. But I like your point, Eric, that there's also maybe space we can create to talking about the values of the Ethics Bowl and what are we doing here, and different kinds of thinking about argumentation, sort of a meta level reflection on the value of different kinds of ethical conversations. And I think often we sort of forget to have those conversations, either because we're cramming in a lot of theory or trying to get through a bunch of moral issues or cases. And so I think it's great that you raise those issues here, but we could also do so in the classroom too. All right, Michael, and then Kyle.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what Eric said too. And so I've used Ethics Bowl cases and also the Ethics Bowl format in our intro level gen ed ethics class. It's been a few years since I've done this because the last time was pre-COVID, but something that I'll do is in like the first or second day of class at the beginning of the semester, I'll give the class a short Ethics Bowl case, just have them discuss it sort of free form. But then towards the end of the semester, I will actually give them cases and assign them to groups, and we'll do an actual sort of mini Ethics Bowl in the class. And one thing that's very helpful is we use the scoring criteria. It's a sort of pre-made grading template, which is nice. You know, by that time, the students will have learned some theory, will have learned some of the skills about developing arguments and things like that. But like Eric was saying, I think the format and the goals and the values of Ethics Bowl really help students have constructive and collaborative civil discussions about these things in ways that I think they really appreciate, and allows them to not only dig deeper into the issues, but to see why they matter, to Michael's earlier point, to see why they're important. So that by the end of the term, hopefully the students will feel like the class itself has been more rewarding to them, even though it's a gen ed course that they're sort of required to take.
So I guess I'm next.
Yeah, Michael, go ahead, Kyle. Yeah.
Yeah. I really liked your question, Suzanne. So I'm Kyle. I teach philosophy and legal studies at UC Santa Cruz, California, and I'm a former big firm attorney. So before I came to philosophy, I was a litigator. I had a couple of response. I mean, I have very many thoughts about this, but I worry a lot about exactly what you're asking, right? Wanting to teach students how to speak up for themselves, not just in a civil environment, but in an adversarial one, and in one where they're nervous and anxious and people are yelling at them. This is part of why I think the competition part of Ethics Bowl is so important. There's like a long running debate among a bunch of philosophers over whether this is a good idea to make ethics a competition. And it's exactly why I think it's valuable, right? Teaching a student to try and speak up for themselves when they're nervous and when they're having that experience is just deeply valuable. So that's like an argument I've been making for years to folks who don't like the competition part. But I also think, so again, as a former lawyer, I think the skills we're training in Ethics Bowl are actually some of the best responses to toxic environments. Actually listening to what the person is saying naively, like you don't really think that, right? It can be devastatingly effective in a context where someone is trying to trigger you, right? Or trying to undermine what you're saying. So like, I have a lot of students that are lawyers now, and I still talk to them about their Ethics Bowl experience and how useful it was as, say, like a public defender. This kind of constant influx of aggression and anger coming at them, that it's still one of the most important experiences they had before law school, before all that. So, yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyle. And Jess, you got us sort of started down this path. So yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So another question, I really appreciate everybody's insight on the syllabus design, because even though it's still I'm still writing my syllabus for the fall. So it's kind of up in the air.
You're way ahead of me, so don't.
That makes me feel better. Another question I have though is, once the syllabus is written, I'm trying to do some course planning in advance as well. And I try to, for all of my classes, have one active learning activity in every class, and to have some variation in the kinds of active learning. So I have some different kinds of like public speaking, active learning exercises that I've picked up. But if anybody has like in-class active learning exercises that I could just steal and put into my classroom, I would totally appreciate any insight you have about kind of classroom management to teach public speaking skills or any kind of active learning activities. So I have a few if you want to hear about them, but I'm really curious to hear what you guys do.
Jess, in a minute, I'd actually love to hear from you about some of the things you do. I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to maybe it's a word of caution. I think one mistake sometimes people could make with cases in the classroom is that I don't think what you could do, or what I wouldn't do, is just like, okay, Monday we do a case, and then Wednesday's another case, and then just case every day kind of thing, where that becomes the active learning. I mean, I think you could use cases pretty frequently, but I think one, and I'm using this as a way to open this up as a question to everyone, is how you structure. Larry, I saw in the chat you mentioned, do we have themed packages of the cases? And that's something we need to work on. How do you sort of intentionally build, I'm going to use this case or these cases here, and then later these cases, and then later those cases, so that you can tease out different kinds of moral thinking as you go. I think a mistake people can just make is, like Ron, you said this, like the conversation is the point. But if you don't add any structure to that, right, then you can just get in this like, well, that was fun, and they don't know what they're learning. So for me, in terms of you thinking about ethics bowl cases as part of this active learning, I guess my 2 cents would be to always be thinking, like what I try to do is like, I start with cases that are very consequentialist, because you can basically understand harms benefit reasoning without much heavy lifting. And then I try to find cases that problematize that maybe bring in a virtue ethics or a sort of, concern about rights. And then you'll see that there's other cases that raise other conceptual questions, and those might come later. And so that's one way I think about, connecting the active learning to what sort of outcome I'm trying to achieve in that part of the course. So do other people have thoughts about any specific strategies about how they try to bring in specific kinds of cases, but also to Jess's question, other active learning activities that you bring into your classrooms? Otherwise, we'll just make Jess answer her own question and tell us everything she does.
Well, just to give you a sense of what I have in mind, I'll tell you 2 things that I've used as a coach that I plan to use in the classroom as well. So I have 2 different goals with this class. One is to give them a knowledge of ethics and like skills in ethical reasoning. And then the second is public speaking skills. And so maybe part of it's the public speaking thing. One is to help them with word economy. So some students, I think when they get nervous, they just ramble on a lot, as we all do. And so I do an activity called Countdown, which they do with partners. So they have to think about what they're going to argue for relative to a certain case that we've read before, that we've discussed as a group during like the rest of the class. And then with their partner, they first go 5 minutes or 4 minutes, depending on how much time we have in class, presenting their case. And this is an activity that takes like a half an hour or 20 minutes. And then their partner will say some feedback about how they presented their argument for the case. And then they have to just do it again, but they have 3 minutes. And then they get feedback and they have to do it again and they get 2. And they get feedback, they have to do it again, 1 minute. And what they learn is that they could have said everything that they wanted to say in 1 minute if they actually were prepared. So like a lack of word economy is a sign that you weren't prepared for your case. But if you play Countdown, then you can kind of learn how to tell the difference and to really get to the heart of the matter more quickly. And then another one I do is called Variety Pack, and it's like a hot potato thing. So one thing that's effective when you're arguing is if you have different kinds of arguments that make an emotional appeal, arguments that are translatable in premise conclusion form, like just an argumentative variety. And so when I was coaching, I would have like 5 students or whatever, and we would have one argument, just a single kind of argument about a case that they thought was a good argument. And they'd have to go through like hot potato, like they'd have like a hot potato they could like toss to each other. And they'd have to have a different kind of argument, a way of making that same argument to show them what the difference is, argumentative variety. So you can make the same point in 5 different ways. And then you can kind of think strategically about like, what is the most effective way to make this point? Is it to like make an emotional appeal, or is the more effective way to like cite the wisdom of the ages in some way? I don't know, whatever. And so those are 2 things that I have planned. I'd like to have just a ton of different things. If everybody else has things they do in the classroom, you could tell me what they are, but that's an example of the kinds of active learning things I'm looking for.
Those are great. Thank you so much, Jess. And there's a question in the chat. Can we put archive some of these things somewhere? And what we'll do either at some point this weekend or shortly after, when we're getting follow-up materials to you, is we'll put out a request for people to send us materials, and then we'll try to get those archived on the website so that we can just keep building our ethics bowl resources up. So Jess, we might be reaching out to you. You were asking for help and said we're going to turn the tables and just get you to help everyone else. So look for us to follow up with you. Yeah, Deborah, and then Megan.
So one of the things that I think is really helpful to think about is the structure of what a class looks like and the purpose of the class. So, and I want to sort of pass some credit off to Robert English, who is on this call here. He is our brand new coach. I've moved on to directing the brand new center at our university. And so Robert is taking over the coaching of our team. So shout out to Robert, congratulations. One of the things that we've done in the past with our class is we've used it as preparation for the ethics bowl competition itself. And so it's not just a standard intro to ethics course or a standard introduction to professional ethics course. And if that's the kind of structure that you or goal that you have for the class, then how you intersperse theory and cases is a little bit more difficult, because at least for our university, we start pretty early. And so the cases don't come until a good portion of the way into the semester. So what we've been doing so far is introducing some normative theory, talking about argumentative strategies, having students practice and engage in scrimmaging. But then when it comes to the actual cases, when they drop, having to make some really quick decisions as to what cases to discuss and how to pair them. One of the things that I've done in the past, and I'm sure Robert is doing some really innovative things now, which are quite different, is I tried to pair cases from the packet which themselves were in tension with each other. So as John mentioned, he would start with consequentialist approaches of theory and then look for cases that problematize that. What I always tried to do is to find two cases that made each other problematic. So it might be case number 1 and case number 7, but I would run them in the same week where the students would talk about them in the same week, because it would force them to deepen their approach and their thinking about each one of the cases, because each of the cases provided a conceptual challenge to some of the assumptions I knew they were probably going to be making. So that's the first thing to say for just class structure and some of the tips and tricks. But one of the things that we've also done in that class, which I think is a really helpful activity, is that rather than having students just do scrimmage or do conversations paired with the countdown case where it's students one-on-one, we have them work a lot in groups because it really lessens their anxiety. And they have some activities and assignments where they have to do collaborative research before they do the debate themselves. So they have guided discussion questions for things that they have to look for in the cases, and they have to work through together to find some of the answers to those questions and to work on the cases. And then they have to collaborate and come up with an approach that they want to take when presenting the case to the rest of the class for the first time. So from the get-go, from the very first minute they're ever approaching the case, they're engaged in group conversations about it, but they also have to come to a compromise. So that's a really important part of how we've been structuring those classes, is very much group compromise based. So Robert, I'm going to let you jump in if you've got much more innovative things to say at this point, since you've taken over the coaching.
No, at this point, I've just been following that same sort of strategy, having first meeting in the week, having them do cooperative research, brainstorming in class, argumentative strategies for thinking about how to approach the cases. And then that sort of cooperative work that they do in class helps them get more familiar with each other, helps them get more familiar with the material, deepens their understanding. And of course, that in-class cooperative research and discussion depends on them having done work outside of class as well, doing background research into the cases, background application of normative ethical theory. And then when, say, the debate meeting comes, they've already been chewing on the material so much, both from an empirical dimension, thinking about the details of the case, and from a theoretical dimension, that they usually feel much more comfortable and they're ready to hit the ground running. So, I mean, I found thus far that structure has worked really well. I thought it was a hit when I did it last fall, and I don't know, I might tinker with some things this semester, but I'm not really sure what yet. That may be a judgment call that I make depending on the attitudes of the students, but yeah.
All right, thanks to you both. I'm just going to interject one thought that popped into my head, then we'll get Megan. I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order here. Megan, Matthew, and then Larry, first name, reverse alphabetical. I was just going to say, Jess, that it occurs to me that in addition to what Deborah just said about cases that are in tension with each other, for those of us who've been coaching or involved with the ethics bowl for years and years, you tend to just develop this, all of a sudden you realize like, oh, this case is sort of weirdly like this case from 6 years ago, but I don't mean plot level similarity. I mean like, oh, there's a similar sort of ethical concept here that wouldn't be apparent if you were just sort of looking at these cases at face value. And that can be a fun activity, is if you gave students two cases that were dissimilar and said, find the sort of overlapping ethical question that, you know, because I think argument by analogy is a very, speaking of having lawyer brain, can be a very powerful way of arguing. that we don't often teach. And so having those archive of cases where you could look at two cases and say, these cases look very different, but my contention is there's a similar way into thinking about them both. What do you know, see if you guys can find it. And I think it was Ron earlier mentioned generating moderator questions is another activity. So that's a thing that I think people do a lot. So let's get Megan in here and then Matthew and Larry. Larry, I'm just putting on hold because we heard from you a little bit earlier, so getting new voices. Go ahead, Megan.
Hi, thank you. Genevieve and I teach ethics bowl, ethics bowl style ethics courses. And so we have a variety of students who are taking it as just taking ethics as a gen ed, and we're trying to drum up interest in ethics bowl and in philosophy with our course. And we have a special schedule where we teach one course at a time. So it's really intensive. It's 3.5 weeks long. And so students are taking one course at a time, right? We're teaching one at a time, and we're in the classroom every day for 3 hours. So we don't have the benefit of that, the time to really develop skills and let them digest material and work collaboratively, over the course of 15 weeks. So try to get off, right away, hit the ground running. And what we've been doing is we have cases. So we begin with cases from a book, Ethics in Action, a case-based approach. Because in that book, the authors, they developed this helpful, strategy for approaching ethics cases that, has the Carver principles. So you've got consequences, autonomy, virtue, equality, and so on, and then also, so you've got the main framework of a moral principle. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for, the approach really helps them to methodically and carefully frame the ethical issues that they see in the cases. And so almost every day, starting, after I think around day 3 or day 4, after I've really helped develop their vocabulary, because for me, that's a really important part of their ability to engage in these discussions, is the development of their moral vocabulary, not just their understanding of the issues, and so once we've laid that foundation down, then we start with every day, they have a case discussion, followed by, then we've got a lecture and analysis, theoretical analysis, and class discussion together. And we put them in groups. And so there are 2 rounds of case discussions. The first round, and they've got roles. They have roles in those groups. So in each case discussion, there's a facilitator, participant, and a recorder. And the jobs, the tasks assigned with those roles change from one round to the next round, And this is all preparing them for the mini ethics bowl competition, at the end of the course. So I hope that makes sense. Genevieve, did you want to add anything?
Nope, I think you summarized it perfectly.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Megan. It's a helpful reminder that some of the formats of courses are pretty different. And so you got to really rethink how we teach it based on how the course itself is set up. Yeah. Matthew.
Hey, everyone. I'm Matthew. I'm down at A&M San Antonio, and I'm the occasional director of the Texas Regional. I like to stress the occasional part there. I'm really enjoying the examples y'all got, and I'm going to be stealing some of these. I'm teaching my ethics bowl class in the fall. I thought I'd share something that I do at the very beginning. And Justin, I think you're the one that mentioned that one of your goals is public speaking. And so one of the things I want to do, maybe even before we have the cases, is I want to get the students doing some talking in front of each other. And I want to start making some basic moral arguments, but maybe before we've had time to do any of that research, and also do a little little bonding so they get used to each other and comfortable with each other. And so I try to come up with, I'll do a scenario where, I'll give them a topic, maybe give them 30 seconds or a minute to prepare and have them speak for just a minute or two. So they have to sort of do that on the spot. Everyone's going to do it. We're going to take turns, but I try to make up really silly moral questions for them for this first exercise. So I pulled up the list I used last time. And literally I make them answer questions like, why is it wrong to, and then I've got this whole list. So why is it wrong to take candy from a baby? And let them come up with an argument for that. Why is it wrong to mess with Texas? For lots of reasons, I'm sure. To trim your fingernails in public, to pay with pennies at the grocery store. And then I'll throw some in that show my own biases, like why is it wrong to drink iced coffee? But, because it's very wrong. But what it does is early on, it gets them talking to each other. Maybe it gets them chuckling a little bit. It builds a little camaraderie, but they're also talking about something that maybe is a little bit more comfortable. And then you build from there. You say, oh, these were the good things. Let's build from there. And you start doing your research and you start doing that sort of thing. Anyway, so that's the sort of nonsense that I'm up to.
Matthew, I'm going to guess that Alex's thumb is about the coffee comment and not about your general approach.
I assume it's about all of it, just because that's who I am.
Well, I'll get to Larry and then Robert, but what I like about what you said, Richard and I were talking a little bit earlier about how some students tend to come into classes as relativists, or at least they think they are. And we were talking about the tension between like spending time dealing with like a Rachel's article against relativism versus just getting them into making arguments. And then they just realize from making arguments that they're not relativists because they actually are giving arguments intended to persuade rather than just saying, well, it's just my opinion, this and that. And when you pick funny things, they actually get all geared up to try to persuade you that drinking iced coffee is actually bad. And so I find that I spend time at the beginning of my classes talking about what is argument making as opposed to thinking about things like relativism. So, okay, Larry and Robert. Larry first and then Robert.
Yeah, I really have a question. And this idea of grouping cases together, similar cases and so on, finding similarities between cases sort of hit me with the question of getting things started, which to me is maybe the most difficult thing in terms of how do you start? You get these 15 cases right after Labor Day, and how do you carve them up and prepare the cases? And so I'm wondering different ways of doing that. And I'm thinking this year about asking them the first week, if you meet, thinking about meeting on a weekly basis, for example, the first week to read all 15 cases, as opposed to breaking it down into, we'll start with these 5 and then we'll do 5. That's the way I've done it. And just because of, so I'm wondering if people do that, or how do you get started, or how do you carve these cases up in terms of grouping them together? How many cases per week, for how many, given that we all have the same number of weeks to get ready for the Ethics Bowl in November. I'm just looking for new ways and thank you.
Thanks. Robert, do you want to get in here, or should we answer Larry's question a little bit first and then? Oh, you're muted.
My point was just the quick observation, sort of piggybacking off the point that Matthew made, that one way that I like to start the class, when I first taught my Ethics Bowl structured class last fall, was I sent them a case from nationals before the very first class meeting. I said, hey, read this case. Be prepared to come in and talk about it. We may have some kind of debate. We may have some kind of conversation. I don't really know yet. And then when I got into class, I did some introductory work. And then I basically set up something like a debate where I just selected them at random, and I let them organize themselves within that random selection in whatever way they wanted. I let them present their answer to the question that I gave them in whatever way that they wanted, just to try to get them comfortable speaking with each other and just to try to see how they would self-organize. And it went really quite well. I was surprised. I didn't really know what to expect, but they all hit the ground running, and they didn't. And I also wanted to see how they would deploy moral argument, moral reasoning, moral theory in sort of a folk sense when put into that. Sorry, now my case might have been something of an odd one because lots of the students had debate backgrounds, so they were really enthusiastic in that respect. But I think I'm going to do that again. That is, I intend to send them a case from nationals or from regionals before the very first class meeting and hit the ground running on the first day of class talking about ethics bowl cases. And whether I structure it in terms of a traditional ethics bowl format, I don't know yet, but I found that helpful and the students seem to really dig it. So for what that's worth.
Robert, just to clarify, is that the ethics bowl, like the class that generates the team? Okay.
This is the ethics bowl class that generates the team. Of course, this was, a solid month before we had the fall regional cases. So I used one of the old national cases just to, generate discussion and get them, set the expectation that they were going to be talking and batting ideas off each other from the very beginning.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Brian.
Hey, thanks, everybody. I'm from the University of Florida. I do like this idea about pineapple on pizza. One icebreaker I've had students do would be, give me your hot take. And your hot take was something that you really feel passionate about that most people simply don't or disagree with. And I remember one of my students said, I think baseball is the most boring sport ever invented. And I think it's the greatest sport ever invented. So again, we had very huge polar perspectives in that particular regard. To get them to start with something where there's definitely some passionate ideas that are really not threatening, I think is very helpful. As a former Army officer, we have a concept for training called crawl, walk, and run. And so the idea is to get these students to crawl and walk is pretty important. And many of the first cases I use are cases the students give me from the past. So one assignment I have in my class is give me an ethical dilemma you face at some point in your life. And I'll give you one good example. I had a young man and he said he's the captain of his high school soccer team. And Larry, let's imagine you're the captain of the soccer team and you're really great. And we've been best friends since kindergarten and I can't play soccer worth a hoot. I'm always on the bench. And Coach Matthew has asked you to pick 7 players to play in a charity tournament. It's a lot of fun, it's low stakes, there's no trophies. And Larry, I turned to you, my best friend since we were in grade school. And I said, Larry, that's great. What other 5 players are you going to pick to be on this 7-player charity soccer tournament? Now, that's the ethical dilemma of loyalty. I'm asking you for way too much loyalty. But these are, quick, simple cases the students can imagine themselves in, situations from high school or college. One thing I do in the classes I teach is I actually do give students our regional ethics bowl cases, put them in groups of 4, give them 2 or 3 cases and say, I want you to go out and find articles that you think provide information that's relevant to the cases. So that's how I get a lot of mileage out of the cases. So really I'm having my classes do a lot of the homework that the ethics bowl team would have to do. You can imagine 5 students researching 17 cases is a lot of work. But when I have 2 classes of 20 researching 2 or 3 cases and gathering information, that's another technique that helps. So I primarily use ethics bowl cases in my courses to give students a couple cases to say, go find relevant information you think is germane to the important topics for this particular case.
Right.
The last thing I offer is this. In my class, and I'm fortunate the class is capped at 30, they're in groups of about 4 or 5, maybe 6. The very first day of class, I have them turn to the people at their table. And I say, I want you to make the following promise. I promise I will come to class prepared every single day to make you better at ethical decision-making. And so in essence, every single time you come to class before you leave, your job is to make people at your table better. It's the idea that iron sharpens iron. And so hopefully it's not me trying to make 30 students better. It's 3 or 4 peers trying to make each other better. And so I try to set that mindset from the very first day of class.
That's great. Thanks, Brian. And I love the last point you made with it, because I think that is one way that Ethics Bowl really does shape our teaching for the better, is it really gets us focused on the idea of collaboration at the outset among the students. Whereas I think some traditional approaches to teaching ethics can forget that. Yeah, Jess?
Okay, so this is my last main question for the group. I was so overwhelmed by planning this course. Another thing that I'm trying to get them to think of me about is usually I'm in the role of like professor type thing, but I want to kind of cultivate like more of like a coach identity where I can give them more critical feedback without them worrying about it like affecting their grade. And to like, I feel like the teacher-student relationship has a kind of adversarial vibe in a way that like the coaching relationship doesn't. And then some students like take coaching in the classroom context better than others, but I'm worried about the students who don't take coaching well in a classroom context, and like ways of overcoming that, of like how I could kind of cultivate more of that ethos in the class or identity in the classroom. I don't know if I'm being clear about what this is, but like, how do I make it so that I can, if you have any advice about this, where I can make it so that students are more comfortable taking really big risks without worrying about their grade or without trying to think that they have to argue against me or feel defensive, but where they can actually just like internalize feedback. So I have some things with like how I'm thinking about the grading, but if anybody has thoughts about that, of like transitioning from like the teacher role to the coach role in this kind of a class, that would be helpful to know too. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Deborah and Michael, are your hands in answer to Jess? Because I think this is a great question. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Deborah.
So Jess, this is a great question. And I think that it is a process that there's a shift over the course of the semester. And one of the ways that you can make that shift is by the creation of certain kinds of graded work. So as I mentioned earlier, for our class, what we have done in the past is students are graded on the collaborative research that they do and the answers to those guided questions that they have to do about each one of the cases. So that's the graded work. But when it comes to their performance, talking through cases, debating cases, answering questions, engaging with each other about the cases, I use one portion of the syllabus where I have a grade assigned for participation. So that's going to be like a standard class, any discussion-based class, so that students who are not engaged with each other, who are looking at their cell phones all the time, right? That's where you can treat that like a regular class. But then as we go through the semester and the students start engaging in more actual debate scenarios, what I do is start transitioning more of a coach. This is not graded. So what I'll do after each team presents their argument and the other team is prepping, I'll zip over to that team and I'll whisper and tell them all the things that they did really well. And then I'll say, and hey, by the way, here are the things that you didn't do quite so well. You might want to think about these particular points coming up because, you know, they're going to be raising those worries for you. And then they go, oh, right. And they instantly get huddled together and as a team again and start working on ways to deal with those objections. And then I do the same for the other team after they present. So I transition my time and my interaction in the classroom to being one of support and giving them suggestions for how to improve, but then also giving them tips for what they might be thinking ahead for about with coming objections as a prep, right? As a coach would. None of that's graded. So their actual graded work is for their research projects, their written work, their oral presentation at the end of the semester where it's their own individual work. And that's how I separate having a class where you're simultaneously a coach, but also a professor grading work. I'm sure lots of folks have other ideas too.
Yeah, at the risk of being annoying, I'm going to say one quick thing and then we'll get Brian and Michael. Just the one thing I found is that sometimes the aversion is not to feedback, but to public feedback. And so that's where I find written case study analyses to be really useful because I can be pretty, you know, give a lot of comments to them. And, you know, and I might say, this doesn't really impact your grade, but think about this, think about that. And they tend to be more receptive because they're not being quote unquote shamed in front of their classmates. So just a thought. Yeah, Brian, and then Michael. Brian, I didn't notice your hand is blending into the background, so I didn't see you ahead of Michael there, but go ahead.
It's all good. Jess, I gave you my email address there if you want to reach out and we'll touch base a little bit later. The one thing I would say is this. I tell students, this is not a classroom. This is the ethics gym. And if you want to feel comfortable, then just drop the class. You don't want to be here. Nobody goes to the gym to sit on the couch. You go to the gym to work out, lift weights, and get stronger and get better. And so the whole idea I gave earlier about iron sharpens iron. After about 2 weeks, the groups of 4 or 5 students at a table start to say, oh, Jess, how was your birthday? Oh, hey, Michael, how was your trip back home to, you know, see your parents? And so at that point, they start to feel more comfortable pushing their students to actually exert more in the ethics gym. But we need to take this phrase called safe spaces in higher ed and say, this is not a safe space here. This is called ethics gym. And if you want a safe space, leave the class. If you want to get better at making hard, difficult decisions, then get ready. We're all going to work out and your teammates are going to spot you. We're all here to make each other stronger and better. But that mindset has to start at the very beginning to kind of help reframe what the class is all about. The last thing I'll say is, even though grading is kind of controversial, I tell my students, you have to try really hard to not get a B+ or better. You have to try really, which pretty much you didn't try. I have like a quick, like 7-minute quiz to start the course, and it's on the readings. And if you didn't read, you're going to get a 0, and you're going to get one of those B's or B-. If you do the reading, you get 100% on the quiz, and then we jump into the real part of the class.
Michael, you're going to come pretty close to having the last word here because we're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes.
Okay, I'll be quick. Yeah, so one thing I've started doing in the last couple of years, even though we've had a class devoted to Ethics Bowl for about 5 or 6 years, is precisely on this question about, getting students feedback in a way that they'll really be receptive to it and take it in, is that I've moved away from a traditional grading system to a specifications grading, where each assignment, right, each element in the class, I don't grade it A, B, et cetera. It's either the students completed it satisfactorily or they didn't. And every one of those assignments, for instance, I have them do quick bullet point summaries of the cases very early on. And then at some point they'll do a sort of a draft of a presentation.
Call her on her cell phone, maybe.
They'll have those.
Wait, they're there. They're there. Okay.
They'll have those turned in by a specific date, but they're not done yet. The next step is I give them feedback, and they have to revise according to that feedback, and they can go back and forth, 3 or 4 times. But they understand from the beginning of the class that that's part of the process. And to get that particular specification of the class completed satisfactorily, they have to go through that process. And we're all going through, every student, is going through that process together. But it's, in a sense, low stakes, right? Because they're not getting, marked up and graded with a number or a letter at every stage. And I think that is helping them.
No one can hear what you're saying, John.
John, you're muted.
You have to unmute, John.
Didn't that make it sound interesting the way I talked with my hands? I was saying passionately, yeah, we're out of time. And if anyone has a pressing need to speak now. Otherwise, we'll take a break. And Michael Jordan is going to be leading our next session about coaching. So kind of a natural transition into that next session. So that'll start in about 15 minutes. So, but yeah, thanks for being part of this session, and we'll see you in a few minutes, everyone. And we'll definitely try to get some of these materials that have been mentioned in the chat up and make it a resource for people. And yeah, cool.